The library burned for 3 nights, yet it was not gone. On the 4th day, the workers returned and found the ash moving, curling toward their hands as if it remembered every touch. Words appeared in the black dust, confessions, betrayals, crimes they had never committed, and the smell of burnt flesh and ink clung to their skin. One touch too long, and the ash wrapped around him like a living thing, drawing warmth, thought, and memory into itself. When the city woke, he was gone. The ruins were empty, but the whispers remained. The fire had devoured the library for 3 nights, a river of flame that swallowed ink, parchment, and timber until the very heart of Paris seemed to smolder in mourning. On the 4th day, workers returned to the ruins, expecting nothing but black dust, broken beams, and the lingering tang of charred paper. What they found instead was alive in a way that defied reason. The air trembled with a faint vibration, a hum that pressed against the temples and lingered in the chest, carrying whispers that could not be traced to any mouth. Ash drifted in thin motes, catching the light of the sun that had dared to peek through the smoke, and yet the dust clung to skin and clothing, heavy, sticky, as if it remembered the heat of bodies that had touched it. It smelled of iron and copper and something deeper, older, almost sweet and unmistakably human, a scent that set the nerves on edge and made every inhalation a small, trembling surrender. Shadows pooled unnaturally in the corners of collapsed shelves and toppled frames, forming shapes that bent and stretched against the windless emptiness, leaning toward the men as though they could see them, as though they demanded attention. Fingers brushed the ash with cautious curiosity, and the piles shifted slightly under the touch, as if the dust itself had weight, had memory, and knew precisely how it should feel. The workers noticed that some fragments of paper, barely clinging together, seemed to lift in the slightest breeze, curling toward them like hands reaching for warmth. Words began to shimmer faintly across the blackened surfaces, forming letters that the eye almost refused to believe could exist in the remnants of flame. They twisted and trembled as if alive, coiling into phrases that the mind could not initially comprehend, recounting details not of the city above, but of lives long past, crimes committed in secrecy, betrayals whispered behind closed doors. The sensation was both repulsive and mesmerizing. To touch the ash was to invite the past into the skin, to feel the weight of memory pressing through centuries of ink and smoke. The ground beneath the ruins exhaled heat, not evenly, but in pulses that seemed aligned with the shifting shapes above, as though the library itself measured the presence of the living and responded in kind. Each step stirred the ash with a small sigh, a frictional voice that rubbed against ears and lungs alike, and sometimes the air thickened, clinging to the throat, pressing on the chest, as if to remind the workers that they had entered a space no longer theirs to command. Occasionally, the shadows would condense, darken, and a form would emerge that resembled a human outline, only to dissolve into drifting motes when observed too closely, leaving a lingering impression on the mind that persisted longer than sight could justify. The pages, blackened and brittle, emitted a subtle warmth where touched, and when lifted, sometimes for only a heartbeat, they revealed glimpses of text that had never been read aloud, fragments of confessions, of crimes, of love turned to violence, of memory written in a language older than the city itself. Air smelled like burnt paper, iron, and something intimate, almost alive, clinging to hair, to fingertips, to the creases of gloves, embedding itself as though the act of breathing had become a pact. Each inhalation carried a pulse, faint but undeniable, and the whispers grew with it, layering on top of themselves, thickening the silence into a dense, viscous hum that pressed insistently on thought. By the time the workers dared to look up from the piles, the ruins no longer seemed empty. They were crowded with expectation, with the presence of pages and ash that had remembered themselves, waiting, insistent, and patient, as if the library had not perished in flame but had instead awakened, breathing slowly, deliberately, beneath the ashen sky of the city that had thought it conquered. Each page that survived the inferno flickered in the pale light like embers, their edges curling and blackened, resisting the touch, yet somehow demanding it. When lifted, the words shimmered and shifted, not merely ink on charred paper, but something more, fluid and aware, rearranging themselves in patterns that the mind struggled to follow. Phrases emerged that had never been written in any known hand, histories of people who had never existed, names of streets that had long since vanished, confessions that carried the weight of centuries. The more the workers handled the remnants, the more the pages seemed to read the readers, sensing hesitation, lingering, fear, curiosity, and greed. Each movement brought a reaction. Letters stretched thin and darkened where fingers pressed, faintly glowing lines bending and twisting as if forming shapes from thought itself. They recoiled as the ash beneath them trembled, as if the library itself were alive, as if it could measure intent and respond with careful, deliberate precision. Words crawled across the blackened surfaces, bleeding into one another, forming grotesque stories of lives never lived and crimes that had never been committed but were felt as if they were. Shadows in the corners seemed to lean closer, drawn to the vibrating hum of the pages, dark shapes that shifted with no breeze, condensing into human silhouettes for a heartbeat before dissolving again. The smell of the library had changed, thickening, layering upon itself, the bitterness of scorched paper, the tang of iron, a subtle sweetness like old blood, and beneath it all a faint, unmistakable aroma of decay that smelled more of memory than of death. Each inhalation carried the weight of generations, pressing against lungs, settling in hair, skin, and the folds of clothing, embedding itself in the workers as though the ruins sought not merely to tell stories, but to mark them, to leave impressions of past and present entwined. Pages responded to touch, curling and uncurling with a sentient rhythm, sometimes resisting removal from the ash entirely, sometimes leaping slightly, propelled by invisible hands that guided them into new positions, always aligning themselves into patterns that suggested knowledge far beyond the comprehension of the living. The workers noticed that some phrases were personal, unervingly so, recounting memories not of the city above, but of the lives of those who had handled the books, their guilt, their hidden thoughts, the private failings of heart and hand. It was as if the library absorbed not only words but the essence of those who sought to recover them, pressing it into the ash and smoke, storing it in blackened fibers that held heat and weight. The temperature of the ruins shifted unpredictably, sometimes warm and humid as though exhaling the sweat and breath of those who had perished within, sometimes cold and dry, tasting of soot and the sharp tang of burnt ink, leaving tongues coated with a metallic residue that refused to wash away. Occasionally, faint whispers rose from the piles, untranslatable, layered, a hum that vibrated against the eardrums, intensifying the sensation that the ruins themselves were breathing in time with the living. The ash beneath boots yielded slightly, compressing into sticky impressions that felt disturbingly like palms pressed into the ground, fingers curling slightly as if reaching upward, testing, adjusting, memorizing. With each passing hour, the pages became less passive. Letters stretched and formed small arches and curves, lines coiling around one another to create the illusion of figures walking, standing, kneeling within the ash. The workers found themselves imagining movement that was not there, shadows that did not belong to them, the faint trace of steps that had never been taken, and yet felt as if imprinted on the soil and air alike. Some pages, when turned, revealed grotesque drawings in the ash itself, sketches of faces with hollow eyes and open mouths that seemed to speak silently, twisting expressions that mirrored the fear, guilt, or fascination of the reader. The sensation of watching these things unfold was disorienting. Time seemed fractured. A minute could stretch into an hour. The heat of the sun above felt irrelevant, the light inconsistent, as if the ruins themselves bent perception around their center. When the workers paused, a pressure built along their backs and shoulders, a faint heat in the air that pressed inward, urging them to move, to touch, to continue, as though stillness would be absorbed, claimed. Attempts to collect pages for inspection proved futile. The ash resisted, fragments slipping from hands, dust adhering more strongly where attention lingered, and occasionally entire clusters of papers would rise slightly, shifting in unison as though following some unseen current, forming vague shapes that vanished before comprehension could solidify. Fingers that brushed too deeply into the piles came away blackened, sticky, warm in a way that suggested the absorption of more than heat. Memories, intentions, the weight of thought itself. Workers began to notice that when two people handled the same fragment, letters reacted differently, aligning with one, curling away from another, almost as though the ruin could distinguish loyalty or fear, preference or hesitation. Even when no one looked directly, whispers and faint movements suggested observation, a sentience that extended beyond the visible, rooting itself in air and ash, binding past and present in a continuous, tremulous thread. Entire sections of the library, piles that seemed insignificant by morning, had shifted by evening, forming arches of paper and ash that could support no weight yet appeared stable, intentional. The patterns were not random, but careful, precise, deliberate, an architecture of memory, a cathedral of blackened knowledge that had survived fire not by accident, but by design. As the workers pressed deeper, the ash itself seemed to pulse, expanding slightly beneath the fingers, inhaling and exhaling faintly with the rhythm of the whispers. The more attention was given, the more the ruins responded, pressing closer to the senses, filling eyes, nostrils, ears, embedding itself into thought until it became impossible to distinguish observer from observed. And at the center of the debris, where the flames had been fiercest, the ash glowed faintly, a soft, molten black that seemed almost liquid, trembling with words and images that could not exist outside this place. To touch it was to feel the past, to invite it into the flesh and memory, to risk losing something of oneself even as one uncovered everything. The library had not perished, it had changed, evolving, absorbing the hands and thoughts of those who approached it, turning curiosity into participation, memory into matter, and ash into a living archive that waited, patient, hungry, and aware. By the seventh day, the whispers that had begun as indistinct hums had grown into something intelligible, a low chorus murmuring from the ruins, as if the library itself had discovered a voice. The workers noticed that the air pulsed with a strange rhythm, a cadence that seemed to guide movement and attention, tugging at limbs and eyes, shaping gestures before thought could intervene. Some felt hands brush their own in the dust, delicate, insistent, and yet they were alone, surrounded only by black ash and scorched timber. Shadows lengthened unnaturally with each hour, stretching along the walls and across the rubble in ways that defied reason, coiling around piles of charred paper and curling toward the living as if to measure warmth, intent, and curiosity. Entire sections of ash lifted, drifting slightly before settling again, forming arches, bindings, spines stacked spine upon spine, intricate arrangements that suggested a purpose too subtle, too deliberate for human design. The workers dared not speak, for even a whisper seemed to disturb the fragile pulse that ran through the debris, a pulse that pressed against the chest and temples, leaving the skin tingling and the mind disoriented. The remnants of shelves, warped and blackened, trembled under the smallest vibration, bending as if to cradle invisible weight, guiding pages and fragments into shapes that hinted at their former selves, yet never truly replicated what had been lost. Every movement was mirrored, anticipated. Fingers lifted from ash left subtle impressions that were absorbed instantly, disappearing into the larger whole only to re-emerge elsewhere, altered, rearranged, as though the library had a memory of its own, longer and more patient than any human lifespan. The air smelled heavier, warmer, layered with iron, charred paper, and something subtler, something like the breath of a long-dead reader pressed into the fibers of the pages, carried by the ash into the lungs of the living. Night brought no relief. In dreams, the workers were beset by visions that bled from memory into expectation, shelves rising from flames, forming perfect corridors of blackened timber and ash, ghostly readers turning pages in silence, faces pressing from the piles, eyes hollowed black, mouths opening in accusation, and always the weight of movement above the ground, of a building breathing, alive, beyond fire or ruin. Some awoke to find subtle changes in the ruins. Pages that had been flat now curled into small arcs. Letters reformed into phrases that they could almost read but could not hold. The ash itself a fine sediment of stories and thought, a malleable surface that seemed to record presence and attention with almost punitive precision. Fingers brushed fragments, and they adhered, warm, almost alive, leaving faint stains that could not be washed away, embedding not only memory but thought, impression, and a faint, residual sense of guilt. The workers noticed that certain sections of the ruins responded more strongly to hesitation than to touch, areas where pausing for even a heartbeat caused tremors in the ash, lines of text rippling across burned fibers, images forming and dissolving, an architecture of observation that measured presence like weight on a scale. Shadows deepened in places that had once been mundane, forming vertical streaks that moved as if tethered to nothing but the pulse of the library, bending toward corners, crawling along floorboards, brushing the legs of those who approached, only to vanish when attention sharpened, leaving behind a lingering sense of intrusion. Sounds behaved unnaturally. The scrape of boot against rubble returned in delayed, warped echoes that seemed to originate from a different room entirely, sometimes layered with whispers of text, murmuring lines in tandem with footsteps, creating a rhythm that dictated movement without direction or command. When the workers lifted larger fragments, entire piles seemed to respond, the ash and paper aligning into patterns of grotesque symmetry, as though the ruins were conducting themselves like a living organism, calculating the placement of each charred letter, each fragment of page, to maintain balance and continuity. Even the smallest gestures, straightening a corner of ash, tilting a fragment of burned binding, triggered subtle shifts in surrounding debris, letters elongated, edges curled, tiny motes of ash drifting and joining neighboring piles, forming new shapes that were simultaneously familiar and alien, a reconstruction that obeyed its own logic rather than the memory of the living. The more the workers observed, the more insistent the ruins became. Shadows pooled and dispersed according to where the eye lingered, forming glimpses of structures that could not exist in 3 dimensions, yet seemed palpable, touchable, as though the library had folded space itself to accommodate memory, to preserve thought, to manifest presence. Air grew thick, viscous, clinging to the skin, filling hair and clothing with particles that pressed against pores, leaving a faint residue of blackened warmth, coppery and slightly sweet, as if the past itself exhaled through every mote of dust. Movement through the ruins became a careful negotiation. Step too quickly, and letters would scatter, forming new patterns that shifted unpredictably. Step too slowly, and the ash would cling, heavier, warmer, holding the scent of burnt flesh, of ink, of lost words, pressing into the skin with the insistence of accusation. As night deepened, the workers felt the ruins watching, anticipating, responding. Shadows congealed briefly into human forms, faces pressing from the ash with hollow eyes, open mouths, and expressions that mirrored the smallest flicker of thought, only to dissolve when examined too closely, leaving the mind unsettled, unmoored from certainty. Some sections of the ruins seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the city above, though miles separated the living streets from the charred remains, a distant pulse that measured time and presence, integrating what had survived the fire into a lattice of weight, memory, and intent. By the 7th day, the library no longer resembled ruin. It was something else, something patient, sentient, and aware, a cathedral of ash and blackened paper, alive in whispers and shadows, constructing itself not merely to store knowledge but to measure, observe, and respond, demanding attention, compliance, and above all, presence, pressing endlessly against those who would seek to touch what the fire had failed to consume. A week passed, and the workers began to notice absences that could not be explained by fatigue or distraction. One morning, as dawn seeped gray and ash-laden through the fractured windows, a man was gone entirely, leaving behind only a hand-shaped indentation pressed deep into a mound of blackened paper and ash, the imprint warm and slightly sticky to the touch. The remaining men stared at it in disbelief, a silent testament that seemed to breathe beneath the surface. The lines of fingers curled slightly, as if clinging to something unseen. By evening, other signs became evident. Pages had shifted overnight, curling toward empty spaces, twisting and leaning as though drawn by some invisible gravity anchored to the absent presence. Words thickened, spreading like slow molasses across the fragile surfaces, darker, heavier, forming phrases that weighed in the mind as much as in the fingers, recounting secrets the living had not spoken aloud, memories they had not dared to admit. Some letters seemed to pulse under the touch, elongating and bending, curling into tiny arches that trapped light and shadow in impossible ways, forming shapes that suggested movement, insistence, and awareness. The air grew thick and warm, saturated with the coppery tang of ash and the faint, pervasive scent of scorched flesh, a smell that penetrated hair, clothing, and pores, embedding itself in the skin as though the library itself marked those who lingered too long. When the men reached for more than a single fragment, the sticky blackness seemed to leap into their palms, adhering with an almost sentient grip, drawing out memories, regrets, and fleeting guilt, pressing them into the surface of the pages even as they tried to pull away. Hands that touched simultaneously found letters bending differently for each, one page yielding to one mind, curling in defiance of another, as if the ruins could distinguish the inner will, measuring the depth of curiosity, fear, or hesitation. Shadows deepened in corners, pooling and stretching without wind, forming shapes that briefly resembled the missing worker, faceless and trembling, pressing from the debris before dissipating back into ash. The shelves, once warped by fire, appeared to reform overnight, rising from the rubble with impossible angles, the charred timber curling like the spines of living creatures, arches and bridges of ash and paper spanning spaces that had no support, yet remained uncollapsed, perfectly balanced, patient, deliberate. The workers' movements became cautious, calculated, each step measured against the pulse of the ruins, the faint vibration that ran underfoot, an almost imperceptible heartbeat that seemed to respond to hesitation, to weight, to intent. Footfalls caused ripples in the ash. A pause would generate a subtle quiver that rearranged nearby fragments, letters shifting, curling, forming new sequences that could not be predicted, twisting the past into a present that seemed conscious of the observer's choices. The more they lingered, the more personal the messages became, lines appearing that mirrored the innermost fears, unspoken transgressions, and private desires of each man, as though the ash had absorbed them, distilled them, and returned them in inkless blackness, heavier than thought, sharper than memory. Pages seemed to breathe under fingers, curling upward, then flattening, vibrating with subtle warmth that suggested a presence beneath the surface, something waiting, patient, absorbing not only what had survived the fire, but those who now dared to touch it. The hum of whispers thickened into murmurs, intelligible fragments that repeated names, actions, and moments the workers had long forgotten or wished they could erase, pressing them into the ash as though guilt itself were a pigment, a medium for the living and the dead to mingle. Attempts to remove fragments proved futile. The ash adhered, rising slightly, slipping back into place as though alive, restructuring itself around absence and presence alike. It was no longer merely ruined paper. It had become a vessel, a network of memory and weight, a living archive that measured, cataloged, and integrated the touch of anyone who entered. Each night, the ruins seemed to shift more boldly, the walls of ash and burned timber leaning toward empty spaces where the missing man had been, forming small, arching structures that cradled the void, acknowledging it, reshaping themselves around the absence, pulling new letters toward the hollow, filling the space with narrative and weight. Even as the workers slept, visions invaded dreams, shelves rising on pillars of blackened ash, faceless readers turning invisible pages, letters curling into strange symbols that spoke without sound, shadowy fingers pressing against the mind. Those who tried to speak found their voices swallowed, the air pressing against the throat, the ruins attentive, patient, as though silence itself was required for observation, and any sound might fracture the delicate balance. The boundaries between the living and the ruined blurred. Fingers brushed ash and felt the warmth of memory, of thought, of presence, as if the library had reached beyond its charred form to claim not only bodies but consciousness, measuring compliance, curiosity, and fear in equal proportion. By the end of the week, the men realized that the fire had not merely destroyed a building or its contents. It had awakened a vessel, a construct of ash, paper, and memory, alive in its own right, capable of absorbing, recording, and reshaping everything that approached it. The library was no longer a ruin, no longer merely a repository of knowledge. It was a living, breathing entity, patient and deliberate, feeding on what survived and on those who dared to rebuild it, growing stronger, heavier, and more insistent with each passing day, until the very air seemed saturated with its presence, and the boundaries between observer and observed had begun to dissolve entirely. By the 15th day, the workers could no longer distinguish between the charred books and the ash that had consumed the shelves. The two merged into a dense, black mass that shifted subtly with every movement, every breath. The floor was uneven, covered in a fine powder that clung to boots, trousers, and exposed skin, embedding itself into hair and creases of clothing, leaving a warm, coppery residue that smelled faintly of smoke, blood, and memory. Every step stirred whispers, low and deliberate, as though the library itself exhaled with each heartbeat, and heat rose from the ashen waves, pressing against the calves, thighs, chest, suffusing the body with a sensation of being drawn downward into a presence older than fire. Pages that had once told simple tales, fragments of poetry, histories, and treatises, now narrated unspeakable acts. Murders carried out in shadowed streets of Paris, betrayals of family and crown, confessions of love that had ended in blood, the names and dates of the dead flowing through letters that glowed faintly against the black, as if lit from within by the memory of the deeds themselves. The words shifted when observed too closely, twisting, elongating, forming sentences that seemed to read not only the past but the present, measuring the gaze, weighing curiosity against fear, reflecting the thoughts of those who lingered. The air grew dense, saturated with secrets that pressed against lungs and throat, thick with a sweetness that bordered on the metallic, capable of suffocating if inhaled too deeply, a presence that could not be ignored or escaped. One worker, drawn by morbid fascination, reached to lift a fragment larger than a hand, and the ash resisted, molding itself against his fingers as though the page were alive, as though it knew the shape of his hand and would not release him until it had absorbed some measure of thought, fear, or memory. The sticky black substance pulled at his mind, pressing inward through the skin, bending consciousness toward recollection, dragging memories that were not his own into his mind as though the library had rights over them, claiming pieces of identity to reconstruct its own archive. Shadows lengthened unnaturally across the ruined floor, climbing walls, curling around beams and fragments of burnt timber, forming vertical lines that suggested bodies in repose, watchers, readers from beyond the fire, always observing, always patient, vanishing when the eye sought definition but leaving the mind aware of their presence. The low hum that had begun as a whisper had grown into a resonance that pressed directly against the skull, a vibration unmeasurable by ordinary sound, a chant without words that regulated heartbeat, breath, even the pace of movement, as if the ruins themselves were orchestrating life within the space, directing attention, shaping thought, marking hesitation, rewarding steady motion. The workers noticed that any pause, even for a second, caused the ash to ripple, lifting slightly, shifting letters, forming shapes, lines, words that had not existed before, often grotesque, often accusatory, often intimate, revealing knowledge of private actions, thoughts, and fears. Attempts to isolate fragments failed. Pages seemed to reform around empty spaces, curling toward absence, expanding toward shadows, adhering to each other as if conscious, creating temporary bridges, small towers, arches that had no structural explanation yet remained standing, blackened, warm, alive with memory. A man reached to step across a particularly dense patch of ash, and the ground gave slightly underfoot, pulsing with warmth, sticky enough that it left an impression of weight, of movement, recorded in the powder as though the library was counting, observing, cataloging. The workers began to understand that the library was no longer passive, no longer a ruin to be examined or cataloged. It had become an active force, a living, sentient vessel that absorbed memory, measured presence, and redistributed knowledge in ways that defied comprehension. Even the air itself seemed capable of judgment. Inhaled too quickly, it pressed against the lungs, thick with the residue of blackened history, but breathed in slowly, deliberately. It seemed to permit passage, granting temporary reprieve while recording every thought, every hesitation. Night brought no release. It only intensified the presence. Shadows pooled in corners that had no walls, climbing over charred beams and piles of ash, reaching toward the ceiling, coiling like smoke frozen in time, bending downward toward the living bodies, brushing them with invisible fingers that left the hair standing and the skin crawling. Dreams that night were invaded by impossible libraries rising from fire, shelves stretching into darkness, corridors lined with floating pages that whispered names and crimes, faces pressed against ash and timber, their mouths opening in silent accusation, their eyes aware of guilt, desire, and fear. By the end of the 15th day, the workers realized that the library had surpassed ruin, fire, and human comprehension. It was a living, calculating organism, feeding not merely on the remnants of books but on memory, attention, and presence. It measured each approach, cataloged hesitation, and rewarded or punished according to a logic beyond human understanding. They could feel it in the pulsing ash beneath their feet, in the sticky resistance of pages in their hands, in the hum that pressed against their minds, and in the shadows that lingered, patient, shaping, waiting. No man dared leave without carrying a portion of the library within him, a residue of ash and memory that pressed against the nerves, embedded in the thoughts, and lingered long after leaving the ruins. The library, they understood with a clarity that chilled the blood, had survived not because of walls or fireproof ink, but because it had learned, adapted, and claimed its own existence, a sentient archive that measured the living as much as it preserved the dead. On the 19th day, the ruins had grown impossibly alive, shifting and heaving under the careful observation of the remaining worker, who now moved as though in a trance, each step measured against the pulse of ash and timber beneath his feet. The charred remnants of books rose slowly, forming arches, towers, and bridges of brittle black that creaked faintly, bending under weight that should not have existed, balancing in ways that defied gravity, yet remained perfect, patient, deliberate. Every fragment he touched responded instantly, curling, twisting, letters lengthening into sentences that seemed aware of his presence, aware of his thoughts, aware of his hesitation. The whispers had become a singular voice now, rising from the ash in a low, resonant chant that filled the ruins with a narration no human hand could have written, describing not only the sins of Paris but the private, unspoken crimes, desires, and failures of those who had dared to approach it, their memories pressed into the blackness as if ownership had been claimed. He felt the heat first on his palms, then across his forearms, a crawling warmth that spread like a living organism, black veins of ash clinging to skin, weaving between fingers and across the wrists, feeding on the life within him, each heartbeat a measure of attention and compliance. Shadows gathered in corners that had no walls, coiling around beams and fragments of timber, forming elongated shapes that resembled watchers, readers, observers, pressing near but never touching, their presence insistent and patient, guiding his hands, shaping his movements, teaching him without words what it demanded. The smell of fire and flesh had deepened into something older, more intimate. A coppery sweetness mingled with the acrid smoke of burned parchment and the sharp tang of human memory, saturating hair and clothing, entering lungs and sinuses, embedding itself into nerves until he could not tell where the library ended and his own body began. The ash pulsed underfoot in response to hesitation, rising slightly, forming letters that curled upward to meet the gaze, forming sentences that accused, instructed, commanded, tracing the contours of thought as much as movement. He could feel them beneath his feet, along his spine, the whispering reaching inward as the library cataloged presence, absorbed attention, measured curiosity, and rewarded boldness while punishing indecision. Each time he lifted a fragment, the ash wrapped more tightly, molding to his hand, drawing warmth, memory, and thought into its black folds, imprinting itself in ways that left marks on flesh and mind alike, as though the library was remaking him, piece by piece, into part of its own structure. The low chant became clearer, forming coherent phrases that detailed histories he had never lived, confessions he had never spoken, misdeeds and desires exposed and recorded, tracing connections between his mind and the ash, between his body and the ruined architecture, until he realized with a shock that he no longer stood outside the library, but within it, a vessel and a record, a part of the living memory it had claimed. Time fractured, hours became moments, moments became eternities, and the distinction between day and night dissolved as the library shifted and pulsed around him, expanding and contracting, swallowing space, rewriting itself, forming new corridors, collapsing old ones, until the ruins had grown into a cathedral of blackened memory that stretched higher and deeper than any structure above could have imagined. The air thickened further, a tangible weight of remembrance and attention that pressed into lungs and chest, saturating nerves, and every inhalation carried whispers that reached into thought, bending his will imperceptibly, guiding fingers toward patterns in the ash that were not accidental but deliberate, ordained by some consciousness older than the fire that had consumed the building. He felt the edges of his awareness blur as the ash wrapped along his arms, creeping across shoulders, settling in hair, adhering to skin like a second, sentient epidermis, black veins crawling imperceptibly over flesh, feeding on warmth, marking presence, imprinting history into his body as much as the pages and fragments that clung to his hands. Above, Paris continued unaware. Bells rang, smoke rose from chimneys, streets echoed with footfalls and carts, while below, the library reconstructed itself around him, arches forming, letters curling into sentences that stretched from the floor to unseen heights, shadows threading through air and timber, breathing life into absence, history, and memory. When at last the worker faltered, exhausted and consumed, the library shifted again, rising fully from ruin, folding itself around him, engulfing him in blackened spines, warm ash, and whispering letters that traced the shape of his mind and body, recording every thought, every hesitation, every pulse of curiosity. The whispers rose to a crescendo, forming a single, unified voice that declared not the knowledge of Paris, but the crimes, secrets, and desires of those who had dared to touch, to rebuild, to witness, exposing them as history and memory intertwined, until the ash had crept over every part of him, warmth and blackness entwined until he ceased to exist as he had been. When the city above awoke, the ruins had vanished entirely. No towers of ash, no fragments of charred timber, no lingering scent of smoke beyond a faint, coppery tang in the morning air. The lot was hollow, silent, deceptively empty, yet the footprints leading inward remained, pressed into soil as if guiding the living toward a shadow that moved without form, a presence beyond comprehension, patient and waiting. From that emptiness, the whispers persisted, carried faintly on the wind, narrating stories that had not ended, histories that had not been silenced, voices that had found a new reader, one whose presence would feed the living library far beyond the comprehension of those who walked its vanished halls, a reminder that fire had never destroyed it, only awakened it, and that it would endure, patient, attentive, and insatiable.